Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's nice to be somewhere warm compared to the Eastern Free State. It's quite a mild morning. Um, also a very big welcome to our online folk. We've got quite a big online contingent, I think about 30 people. So it's a nice spread between in-person and online. And it's our big privilege to be running this policy and practice workshop today on woody range expanding species in southern African mountains. Um, Although there's an inherent focus on native range expanding species, we've included alien invasive species in this as well because it's a great example of policy and legislation and a community of practice that's well developed compared to the challenges of native range expanding species. And often those problems are integrated in a single locality anyway, so um, they're not they're not always easily separable. Um, yeah, and just we would really like this workshop to not, it doesn't have a predefined outcome. We really want it to be an engaged discussion. So please note questions, things you want to ask, things you want to contribute, things you want to disagree with, things you want to contradict. It's really a opportunity for critical comment and just engagement across policy, practitioner, and science. And then also as part of this, we are showcasing the preliminary results of our EU Biodiversity Range X project, um, which we've been running for the last 4 years in the Eastern Free State as part of a global consortium. And we'll be presenting the South African preliminary outcomes of that. And this Range X project will be doing sort of global stakeholder engagements in other places regionally and as a global consortium. And this is the first one for the whole consortium, and it's the South African one. So we're quite proud to be leading that part of the project in terms of showing our outcomes. And then I'm just going to hand over to Grant for a couple of things, and then we'll welcome our plenary speaker.
Thank you, Ralph. Morning, everyone. I am chairing this first session. I've also been part of developing the program with Ralph. I'm actually a new face to the Grassland Society, so it's nice to be here and a real privilege. I am historically from Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape, where I'm a director of the Centre for Biological Control. But I've recently moved up to Chaba with Ralph in the ARU and Sandy Steenhuisen in the Department of Plant Science. And I'm working on biocontrol options for a number of invasive tree species in South Africa, as well as looking at general ecology of a number of woody invasives into the grassland biome. So that's just where I fit in. Ralph and I wrote our notes on the same page, so most of my introductions were covered by Ralph. So that's quite easy to avoid. What I wanted to do, though, is Ralph and I were discussing what we wanted to get out of this, and so we didn't know who was going to be here. So it would be nice for us who are trying to get some outputs from this to see who's actually in the room. So I was wondering if I'm not going to do introductions, but if we could just get a show of hands, if you fit into one of the categories I'm going to read out, if you can just say, yeah, I'm sitting in there, or if I miss you, maybe you can just say what aspect you fit into and why you find this session interesting today. So is there anyone representing government in the room? Brilliant. That's turned out well. We didn't know if we are going to have it. Anyway, university representatives, people in research, a couple of people with a few hats on, I see. Sambi? Any practitioners? Guys actually doing the nuts and bolts out there, chopping trees down, herbiciding, on the ground work. Yeah, yeah, that's it. Perfect. Anyone doing technology for the GSSA? Anyone I missed? Anyone just feels... Oh, yeah. Cool. Academic institutions. Brilliant, thanks. Um, cool. So the agenda this morning, as Ralph briefly mentioned, is just a couple of talks on sort of range expanding species. Unfortunately, despite our best efforts, not everyone could make it. So there are two online talks. Three on, well, in the morning session, two. Yeah, two in the morning. And then we're not going to be overly strict. As you see, there's a bit of time at the end, but if you go to 15 minutes, we're going to have no questions. If there's a bit of time, I know Ralph said at the end, but we might be able to slip in any important questions as we go along. And so that's going to, have we made it to 8:30? The time check. So we only really want to start with the plenary at 8:30, right? But 5 minutes. That gives you enough time for intro, hey? Cool. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the session.
Just a technical question. Clive, is it possible to see on the screen who's online? Or is that difficult? It might be nice to just see who's there and so I don't know if you want to give the same questions to the online folk.
It sounds so complex.
Is it? Okay. All right. Okay, well we're seeing the online folks there, all your nice profile pictures. So welcome to you all. Yeah, I see we've got Lesotho represented, Peter Katanga. Nice to have you there. Susie, nice to see you online. Sorry about the family challenges at home. Sue Charles from Zim, so that's great. Lots of problems in the Eastern Highlands of Zim, so that's great. Craig Morris from KZN. Anyone else from outside South Africa? If you want to just stick your hand up on the online. Helga van der Merwe from Northern Cape, Sion. I'm glad to see Peter and Michelle there because they're speaking a bit later. I don't see Honor on yet, but he's still going to be joining us. I think Larato Selaten Kose might be from Lesotho as well. Okay, so that's great, Inyal. Okay, so that's really nice. Charles Chikoma, also Zim. Okay. Okay, so it's my very big honor to welcome our plenary speaker, Prof. William Bond. And it just so happened that the GSSA had already decided that he was going to be awarded the GSSA Prestigious Award before we invited him to be the workshop plenary, and he was able to be here yesterday to receive his award at the gala dinner. So it's really worked out very nicely. Prof. William Bond is an emeritus professor at UCT. He has an A1 NRF rating. He's ranked amongst the world's most influential scientists. He was the chief research scientist at SAON. He is a foreign associate of the US National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the Royal Society and of the Royal Society of South Africa. He has an H index of 113. Lesego, something you can aim for already while you're still young. His I-10 index is 306. As I mentioned just now, he received the GSSA Prestigious Award last night, which is the most prestigious award you can get from the Grassland Society. And more than all of that, he's a great example of passion-driven research. And really, I think for our young, up-and-coming, emerging scientists, policymakers, and practitioners, I think that passion-driven career is really something we want to really encourage. You get those outcomes from the passion, not usually the other way around. And William's the perfect keynote for this workshop, and we're really excited to hear what he's going to share with us today. So thank you, William, for coming all the way from Cape Town to get some sunshine. Thank you.
Okay.
Left, right, and then the pointers.
All right. Great. Morning, morning, everyone, and thanks very much to Ralph Clark for inviting me. I've thoroughly enjoyed the journey up from Cape Town. It was an absolute treat to see the changing vegetation from winter to summer rainfall, and to get into the world of grass. Such a pleasure. My talk has a different title from the one in the program, but this is what the abstract was about. It's really why do our upland grasslands exist? And the first thing to ask is tree line. Tree line is a global phenomenon, much studied in Europe, and from the cold temperate areas to tropical latitudes, trees stop at a line. It's a few meters wide. Sometimes it's more than that. The causes of tree line are not well understood. The best idea at the moment is that being tall has aerodynamic disadvantages. You get bloody cold, and if you're short, you don't. I am not quite aware of that, but I could ask some colleagues, but I won't, Sue. um, Locally, you get some variation due to things like fire and disturbance, which can mess it around a little bit. But it is generally remarkably general. The temperatures of global tree line, it's best predicted by 7 degrees centigrade, seasonal mean air temperature, and a minimum season length of 94 days. So what is a season length? Season is defined as a sum of days where temperatures are above freezing. And a tree is defined as something that's 2 to 3 meters or more. This is from a very useful review by Christian Corner, who's spent his life looking at tree lines. I've been on tree lines in New Zealand, and they're absolutely remarkable. Um, you can see how abrupt they are there, and you just step across, and it's a different world. The trees stop, and you get inverse tree lines. They are fascinating, and I couldn't get them into my consciousness, thinking about the biogeography and the ecology of New Zealand, and they found it very amusing that I didn't understand what a tree line was. There's also the local phenomenon, tree lines. Two types of low temperature limits. There's a life form boundary where trees just cannot grow. It's too cold, irrespective of species, and all of them hit that hard line. But there's also tree species specific tolerance limits, and those reflect where you find them reflects the difference between a fundamental niche, they could be much further up a mountain than you see them, versus the realized niche, which is quite different. So this is an example in Scotland. It looks icy cold, cold moorlands and so on. And then you find these bloody trees are growing there. And all that's happened is that somebody's put a fence up and stopped the animals from browsing. So it's the interaction between cold climate, slow growth of trees, and heavy browsing by sheep produces this apparent barren, treeless landscape. So to try and get an idea of where tree line ought to be in South Africa or Southern Africa, this is a recent paper showing how elevation of tree line varies in the northern hemisphere and then in the southern hemisphere with this bizarre little bump here. I won't talk about that, but we could ask there, where would we have a tree line in South Africa? And a latitude of say around about -30 or so, it should be there. And that is between 2.5 to 3,000 meters. So we certainly find it in the Drakensberg. However, our tree lines, the grassland tree lines, are much lower than that. So where's the global tree line in the Drakensberg? I'd love to know. I don't have the skills to do this, but it'd be easy enough to do to use current temperature records and to map out where tree line would be given that criteria of 7 degrees centigrade, 94 days, and so on. And what happens, if anything? Does anything change there? And then, of course, what's fascinating here is where the trees, these grasslands. Why aren't there savanna trees there? And we're all familiar with this, but this is bizarre. This is an unresolved biogeographic puzzle. It's one of the most obvious patterns that you see in South Africa and in other parts of Africa, and we don't know why it exists. So that's pretty darn interesting. And that's the topic that I want to go at today. So the usual way people proceed is to get massive data sets which are available globally and hunt around for correlations. And this is an interesting study that's not quite published yet, but it'll be coming out very soon, where the guys used dynamic vegetation models, and they also used the latest temperature information on a global scale, and they tried to look for the local existence of the tree line in South Africa. It doesn't fit at all with the global model that they used. They tried to introduce fire, and the fire model didn't work either. So there's lots of things that don't fit globally in our part of the world. But what's interesting here is that that's minimum temperature, and this is the mean minimum temperature at 7.5 degrees, which is not that far off that 7 degrees centigrade cutoff point. And it's a very close fit to the edge of the grassland biome on the eastern side and that northern side there. And you can see there's rather little overlap between grasslands and savanna on this mean minimum temperature monthly thing. So this, I think, is interesting, but I'm suspicious of correlations and whether they're causal or not. And I get more and more concerned about machine learning and all these statistical tools that are fundamentally based on correlations without establishing whether it's real or not. So we did some experiments some years ago, but I'm going to go through them again, trying to find out, is there and where is and why is there a savanna tree line? And we did that by putting out transplants. Very heavy work involved, planting out hundreds and hundreds of acacia tree seedlings across a gradient from down here where it's really warm, right up there to the cold Drakensberg. And there were 10 sites, and at each site we planted these species: Karoo, Gerardii, Tortillus, Cibrariana, and Mearnsii. They are Vachellias, but I'm calling them acacia because the literature that we have, this vast literature, should not be messed around by taxonomists, especially Australian ones. They're rotters. Now they're mixing it up even more, but I won't go into that because it really makes me mad. So what we did here, you can see we had a fence up, so there's no herbivory. There was no fire during the experiment. We used the same soils, all from one locality. We added fertilizer, they were watered, the grasses were cleared. So what we're trying to do is to isolate the climate effects alone on what is happening for trees. They also experienced a very cold winter with some severe frosts, so we could look at frost damage as well. And the first key result is that species vary in frost tolerance. So we don't have a generic tree that behaves in this way. The damn trees vary, so you never quite know what you're dealing with. And then the second key point is that the savanna grassland tree line is much lower than significant frost impacts. So Acox's original idea is not correct. So here's the number of frost days, and you'll see there that there is a grassland with almost no frost days. Grasslands start about 1,000 meters, and there's plenty of grassland down there. We could see whether they were killed by frost or not. You get this sort of thing. Here is the black wattle from Tasmania and Australia, horribly frost tolerant, the swine. but these ones look quite savagely beaten up. But you have to wait to see whether they resprout and whether frost effectively behaves like fire and merely causes top kill. But we also got complete death caused by frost. So here's an example with Acacia gerardii, and this shows top kill with plenty of top kill in the grasslands, whereas the black squares show mortality. And you see that mortality doesn't fit with top kill. And it's only the two very highest sites where you get direct frost top kill. So beware the correlation with frost because it's not necessarily causal. Acacia Karoo, even more dramatic, where you only find top kill right at the very two highest sites. But so you have 1,000 meters of grasslands, or hundreds of meters of grasslands where frost is not having any impact on the tree. And then if you look at the black square showing mortality, it's only the very highest site that had any mortality at all. This is also an interesting species in that the Bloemfontein variant, bloody Free State, is extremely frost tolerant compared to the Shishlui, the Zululand variant. So trees also vary within a species, which adds to complexity, of course. So the second key result from this experiment is that species vary in their growth response to cold. And unfortunately, the black wattle is the least sensitive to cold. And saplings in grasslands generally have slower growth rates than in savannas. So the first thing to say is that there was enormous variation. By the end of the experiment, you could almost sit underneath the acacias we'd planted in the warmest site and have your lunch in the shade, compared to the middle sites where they grew all right, and the top sites where the growth was negligible, really poor and slow. So we were very interested in this because we were working on a model where saplings have to break through that flame zone, out of the grass, through the flame zone, out of that to become a tree. And they can persist and resprout for decades in that flame zone without dying, but the problem is getting out of there. And so the growth rates really matter, as does the condition of the fire. So here's a very simple model. Sapling grows, gets clobbered by fire. Grows again, gets clobbered by fire. Grows again. The intervals between killing fires are long enough for it to escape and grow into a tree. So we were interested in, at the time, CO2 effects, and whether, because of increasing CO2, saplings might grow a bit faster and start escaping, although the fire regime had remained the same. So this is why we're interested in CO2. This is direct evidence for CO2 over the last million years or so from Antarctic ice cores. This is what we've done in the last 100 years or so. And, I've shown this graph quite often, and each time I have to raise the red line because we keep pushing it up. And this is the latest data from Mauna Loa in Hawaii. It's just relentless, it keeps going up. Look at this. The rate of increase is increasing. How stupid can we be as a society? So May this year, it reached 427 parts per million. May last year, it was 424. So in 1 year, almost 3 parts per million growth. Do you know how much that is? If you're interested in storing carbon to try and mitigate against this, that's 22.7 billion tons more CO2 added to the atmosphere in 1 year. And what we now know is that these atmospheric CO2 concentrations of this were last seen 3 million years ago from the latest marine proxies, which is higher than it's been throughout the last ice ages. So the ice age is our time, our species, our savannas, everything in the last 2.6 million years. We're into a new era. And if that doesn't panic you to a degree, it ought to. So the CO2 is a very important marker that our world has fundamentally changed, and we need to take cognizance of that and start thinking about it really hard. So this is one of the consequences. Very nice work by Brad Ripley at Rhodes. And he was looking at seedlings, and he grew them at different CO2 concentrations. And he's become a really good ecologist. For a physiologist, Brad is doing great stuff. He just needed a bit of tweaking to get the ecologist to point him in the right direction. And he's just terrific, man. And what he showed was that seedlings need to reach a certain size before they can recover from a browse event. So if they get browsed, whether by rodents or by goats, they can resprout if they've reached that biomass threshold. Similarly, if they get burnt, they can resprout if they're above that biomass threshold. So he just asked the question, under different CO2 concentrations, how long would it take you to get to that biomass threshold? And that's what it would do the last glacial. It was so slow, it was so awful, it was so starved of carbon dioxide that plants could never get up there quickly enough, and it was a treeless landscape. Compared to the future, where they can grow so fast that very little will damage them. And Brad reckons that this is one of the major features behind the changes in landscapes from the 1920s to the 1990s until today, with trees pouring in, because fundamentally the living conditions for trees have changed. So we were interested now, what about the warming effect? And would a warmer climate promote more frequent escape? And these are the results we got. With Acacia Karoo, Savannah's 6 years, grasslands 12 years, twice as long. But that's nothing compared to Acacia siberana, which I thought would be quite a fancy-looking tree. Savannah's 8 years, grasslands 26 years, more than 3 times longer. Acacia tortilis, hopeless in savannas, 14 years, and usually it's in savannas which don't burn, and 48 years in a grassland. So temperature cold has a massive impact on the growth rates of trees. It's actually more than the CO2 effect, except for this horror, Acacia mearnsii. These rubbish Australian trees, these invasive non-native Australian trees are not blinking with temperature, and that helps to explain why they're so horribly ubiquitous. So to sum it up, transplanting experiments showed that frost is not a factor in extensive lower elevation grasslands. We have huge areas of grasslands where frost is unimportant. Frost does cause top kill and would be influential in the cold, highest elevation sites. Growth rate is much slower in grasslands than in savannas, and few trees would be able to emerge from the fire trap where fires are much the same. And of course, fires can be very common in the Southveld, for example, and more common and more frequent perhaps in savannas. And then this unfortunate finding that non-native species include things that are much less sensitive to cold than our native species. And that, I think, will be a theme that we return to frequently today. Of course, there's a problem, and I'm sure you've all picked it up by now. Before you can worry about saplings growing out of the flame zone, you need to have a sapling. And you need seedlings to establish. But when we were walking around on the edge of the savanna tree line, we couldn't find any seedlings. There weren't anything. So before the sapling bottleneck, trying to escape the flames, you needed seedlings. And what was going on then? So to try and quantify it, we looked at which bottleneck, seedling establishment or sapling release. And we set up transects across an altitudinal gradient. And if it was a release limited problem, then we put out a transect like this. We knew the area, and we asked how many adult trees could fit into that space by looking at the mean canopy area. So in this case, you have 3 adults, but you have many seedlings. So seedling establishment is not the issue. It's the seedlings growing up to become adult trees, if they're fewer than the carrying capacity. Or it could be, in this case, establishment limited, where you have space for 3 adult trees, but you only have 2 seedlings. So there are not enough seedlings to fill potential adult space, and it's establishment limited. So we looked at which stage was limiting in these areas here around Sishlui and then up here in the cold country close to the grass and savanna tree line. And we got these results that most of the time there are lots of seedlings, and the problem is the seedling growing up and escaping to become an adult. But when you get to the high end, close to the tree line, there are too few seedlings, and the problem is seedling establishment. It's not a sapling release problem. You can't find the seedlings. So what's going on? What prevents seedling establishment? Could be consumers, fire and herbivory, munching them up. Could be competition with grasses. Could be the physical conditions, too dry, too wet, too cold, too frosty. Or it could be the interactions between them, as we think it is for cold and fire for sapling release. And so, the thing we've been ignoring so far were the grasses. And the grass filter can be profound. What are grasses doing along the elevation gradient? Functionally, we had found out that grass competition against tree seedlings is negligible above ground, but there's profound competition below ground, formidable. This is work with Mike Kramer. That's one paper there. There are quite a string of them. So in a vigorous grass swarm, grass roots would always outcompete tree seedling roots, always. So how do tree seedlings ever recruit into grasslands? And that is puzzling. And then we came across this work by Jurena and Steve Archer, the doyen of savanna ecology in the US. A very nice paper where he said, they said you should, in a forest, you look up to see if there are canopy gaps where there's enough light coming through for a sapling to grow through. In a grassland or a savanna, what you have are tree root gaps. So if you look down and you had X-ray eyes, you'd be able to see holes where there's fewer tree roots, fewer grass roots, and those would be the places where you could break through and a seedling could establish. And they looked at the different sizes, whether you need a big, broad gap or a long, thin, narrow one. And it turned out that the long, thin, narrow ones were the best for seedling establishment. So a very interesting idea. So you're stuck now, are you? All right. So we have a red blob on there. Don't ignore that. That is not one of our sites. So we set out 6 sites in savannas through to the high country grasslands. Why only 6? Well, I'll explain in a moment. At each site, we put out a grid with 18 auger pits, and in the pits, we excavated to 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 centimeters, and each 10 centimeters slice. We removed the roots and washed and dried fine roots, and we established whether they were grass or tree roots, primarily grass roots, these fine roots, through using stable isotopes of carbon. This is an enormously tedious task, and without our workers, we would have never managed to do it. So it's an absolute pain, and we've got to find another way of exploring root gaps. But this is the results we got. Along a moisture gradient, going higher and higher up the mountain, you can see you get more and more root biomass. Well, yeah, sure, that makes sense. And then on the right-hand side there, you can see that most of the grass roots are in the top layer, 10 centimeters, but there's still plenty of grass roots down to 40 centimeters. But this doesn't really tell us about root gaps. Where are the gaps? And the gaps is variance. So here you have what it might look like in 3-dimensional space. I'm going to depart from the microscope. This thing. Well, there. Those are the potential root gaps. And how do you find those? Well, we don't know how big a gap you need to establish a tree seeding. So we took a statistical approach, looked across a frequency distribution, and said that the fewer the roots, the more likely it is to be a gap. And so we could look at the lowest percentile percentile across all of our samples, right through to say 45%, where it's getting fuller, where there are more grassroots, a lot more grassroots, and so it might be becoming a challenge. And we asked across the elevation gradient, where do you find roots, these root gaps? And these are different criteria. That's the 45% percentile. And you see lots and lots of root gaps in savannas, diminishing, dwindling to almost none, where you get mosaics of savannas and grasslands, and then almost none in the grasslands. And if we get a more severe line on root gaps, 15% percentile, then there are no root gaps when you hit the grasslands. So it's completely clogged up. Really hard work to discover this, but I think it was fascinating. So in general, savannas had many root gaps, decreasing as you go to medium conditions. Grasslands and sparsely wooded savannas, there's nice park-like Acacia siberana, they have few, if any, root gaps. And grass competition, there's no question, can create a seeding establishment bottleneck. So just to conclude, what's the relevance of all this? When it comes to woody encroachment, the first thing to accept is that with the CO2 we're getting now, outside the entire evolutionary history of most of our savanna trees, and with the warming we're getting in our mountains, together we are creating super plants, super juveniles, seedlings that can do things that they never could for thousands of years, saplings that can do things they never could for thousands of years. It's not a constant across species, and invasive species are particularly problematic because they seem to be able to tolerate lower temperature than our native species. We know nothing about their relative CO2 responsiveness. We have to get a better handle on CO2 effects and their variation, and it's hard to do. I acknowledge that, but I get very uneasy when the lead paper of African Journal of Range and Forage Science says that grass invasion is entirely due to rainfall and cattle and changes in livestock. And there is no mention of the CO2 effects on water use efficiency on grasslands. You simply have to start factoring that in to our understanding of rangelands. The vigor of the grass root layer, that's the least studied, but I think it could be the most potent barrier stopping seeding establishment. And to create a so-called healthy or vigorous below-ground grass sward should be a fundamental aim. And I would imagine that to do so, you need to continue to use fire and browse. If you allow grasses to be unburnt for a long time and they get moribund and start dying, you're creating root gaps. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, William. Fascinating. Sorry.
Yeah.
As mentioned, we do have a session for questions later on, but I think we got a couple of minutes if somebody has a burning question that we can ask now. I've probably got a long question, William. So Australian acacias, they obviously have well, it's left my mind. They impact the soil, which effectively what's the word? They poison the soil, and which excludes the grass. And so it's effectively creating a nurse plant thing where there's these windows in the soil. Would that a massive driver then for the acacia invasion, the Australian acacia invasions? Is they creating windows effectively into the grassland?
Vulnerability.
Sorry, grass. The key vulnerability of grass, especially C4 grasses, is they can't handle shade. So if a tree can get in and start shading grasses, then that's a hole. And the grasses are no longer able to try and inhibit recruitment to the same degree. So once an acacia mearnsii, a wattle, is in, it just shades out the acacias. It's not a poisoning thing. Our grasses are very sensitive to shading. So I think that's the major weakness of grasses. They have to have a device for getting rid of trees so that they can enjoy the sunlight. Ah, so nice to be in the sun.
Justin, we can just repeat it into this mic.
Okay. Thank you so much. You talked about, of course, growing trees and then seedlings recruiting. Do you have any comment on the seeds themselves? Is it a saturated seed system that we're dealing with, do you think? Or how do seeds fit into the whole thing, the actual production of seeds?
So, well, there's a dispersal issue. So how far would seeds disperse into grasslands? And we don't know. But our experience in Shishui was acacia karoo spread throughout the park, and there were with no adults visible for kilometers, but with the animals taking seeds all over the place. And Sibarana is the same thing. Animals eat it; they're distributed widely. So my sense is that, on the whole, seeds are not limiting near the edge. They would certainly be so, kilometers away from the edge.
Question?
So we got some online questions. So Debbie's asking, I would be interested to know how this theory relates to the forb non-tree component in grasslands, where presumably presumably root density also affects the ability of forbs to establish in grasslands.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was thinking about it this morning, actually, in a torrid state when I woke up, realizing that I better get moving. And I don't know. I think I think the forb guys have a very interesting time. The problem with a lot of the forbs, they don't make any seeds. The seeds are very rare, and that in itself is interesting. It's years ago, Dick Yetten, who some of you might remember, pointed out that baboons turn over rocks. So if you have a rocky terrain, they turn over a rock, and when they do so, they compost the grass and they kill it. So there's a little spot of dead grass underneath a boulder. And he's right, it does happen. And he reckoned that's where forbs got in. So there you go.
Okay, sorry, and one more. Susie comments, grass competition has a strong suppressing effect on seedlings/saplings, and the presence of strong grass competition can totally negate the effects of watering and CO2.
Yeah, yeah. So you need a hole. Lots of holes in savannas. It's a very interesting story, but such a tedious thing to work on. We think we have a method for how to do it, but and I had a student lined up, and then we had the worst drought in 50 years, where no seeding survived, so we had to scrap it. And now I'm too old, damn it.
Okay, and then sorry, one more important thing. Susie's saying that the results from Brad Ripley's group's recent CO2 experiments on the different acacia species support your theories.
Yeah. Yeah, no. He must be doing the right thing.
Thank you, William. Can you give him one final applause? Yeah.
I think that that we have more that we can that was safe. It's not a book that I just thanks.
If it's valuable, it might be mine. Next, we have Dr. Kim Canavan, who's going to be speaking about invasive alien trees. Well, the session is supposed to be very much about mountains, and so she's going to be specifically looking at mountains and the invasive plants that are invading them.
Oh. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about a very collaborative project that we worked on, looking at the alien plants and mountains. Wait, do I point it in a quick? Okay, just a bit slow, maybe. So unfortunately, as is happening all around the world, we're seeing an increasing amount of invasive alien plants establishing in our montane areas. And what is increasingly being reported is that many of these invasive plants are woody, shrubby tree species. And what we're finding then is there's this increase of woody densification. This sort of picture, this image is becoming all too common, where we're getting a dominance of trees.
If you stand on one leg.
Okay. And if we look at tree species, it's particularly worrying because this is just a snapshot of our mountains across the country. And they are characterized by not just being incredibly biodiverse, but you can see there's almost a complete absence of tree species further up the mountain areas. So if we have trees starting to establish, this could mean that we ultimately could completely transform these areas. I don't know, my finger maybe doesn't click okay, got to give it pressure. And so that's what we wanted to do in this study. We wanted to understand, what do we currently know? What is the status of alien plants in our mountains? And we did this by firstly delineating the mountain ranges so we could know which areas to focus in on. We could then see the sampling effort up until this point, and then we could start to look at, what are the species compositions that we're seeing, and do we have any patterns that are starting to emerge? So this is the 6 major mountain ranges in the country. And what we found was that there really hasn't been a good, we really haven't come very far in terms of our records of invasive species. We found there's only 29 studies that were focused in on mountain areas specifically. And from that, we could only use the information from 3 databases. These were the only ones that had good GPS coordinates. They weren't localized. They occurred across more than one mountain range. So we looked in at Sapia. This is a roadside surveys that was long-term data all across the country. We used iNaturalist. It's a citizen science platform. And then we were able to use a survey that used botanists to go in and systematically survey across 2 mountain ranges. Okay, that's better. So what we found was there was over 20,000 occurrence records that we could look at, which was 570 alien plant species. Unfortunately, for each range, there really hasn't been good sampling efforts, and really this number is likely to be much higher. What you can see here, this is iNaturalist here on the left, Sapia records on the right, and it's really only for the Eastern Great Escarpment and the Cape Fold Mountains that we have any sort of significant amount of records. From this, we could then look at the surveying spatially. You can see here some areas, particularly close to Cape Town, they've been relatively well surveyed. But if we start to look at the interior, here's the Griqualand Mountains. You can see there's almost no records across most of that range. So it's really disproportionate on what we know according to the ranges. We then wanted to look at the elevational patterns of what our records show. And unsurprisingly, almost all our records are occurring in these lower montane areas. We have so few records even in the upper montane areas. And what was really quite scary is there was almost no records on the peaks, on these tops of these ranges. So we really don't have a good idea of what's occurring further up in these higher areas. If we look at the most abundant species, so this is across the ranges, the most abundant species in the lower elevation areas are most generally then the species that are also most abundant higher up. And most of these species, you'll see here highlighted in red, are woody tree species. So really what is occurring, and I think this is just a really good way to see this is what's happening. If we're letting tree species and shrub species build up high numbers in these lower slopes, so this is a unmanaged pine plantation, over time, what we're seeing is these trees are then increasingly going to move into these relatively pristine areas. And for today, what I wanted to look at was this work was published 3 years ago. And I wanted to get an idea of, since this work was published, what has happened in the last 3 years? Has there been improvement? Unfortunately, we were only able to look at iNaturalist. Sapia has very sadly not been continued in the last 4 years or so, but hopefully that will change. But for now, what we found in the last 3 years, there's been about 4,000 records. And again, it's really only in the Cape Fold Mountains and Eastern Great Escarpment that we're getting surveying carrying on, although this is just looking at iNaturalist. Interestingly, there are 72 new alien plant species recorded from these records, 7 new tree species, 15 new shrubby woody species. Just for interest's sake, these are the 7 new alien plant tree species. Very common trees, but previously they weren't recorded in these mountain areas. Just to take, out of interest, we looked at on the left here, this is the old database that we had, and it's looking at the proportion of the different growth types. And there isn't very much of a difference in the proportions in the new information that we have now. You can see here that the herbaceous species are actually have the most number in these alien plant records, followed by the shrubs and trees. And then we just looked at the most abundant species again, and what we found is there's still a lot of tree species being most abundant, and this is particularly true for the Cape Fold Mountains, with all the top 5 most abundant being tree species. This one is meant to be highlighted as well. So just to conclude, I think what this study was so important is showing is that we really don't have a good idea of what alien plants are moving into the mountains, where they're moving in, and how abundant they are. We're starting to see some patterns emerging that, of course, is quite intuitive, is that if we're letting these tree species build up high numbers in the lower slopes, it really helps push them further, allows them to push further up into these higher slopes. And, when we start to look at, of course, how are we going to start managing this and how are we going to stop stopping the spread of these species? Well, it seems this is really almost the first step that we need to improve. We really need to get a concerted effort to have these surveys done. I didn't have time today to talk about it, but when we have a focused botanical survey with botanists going in, it's incredibly effective, and we're able to really improve our records that way. And so we know that many of these areas are going to be incredibly difficult to control. Sending up teams into these mountains will be incredibly challenging. And so really what we feel is that we really can push for more investment into biological control of these species. A lot of the most abundant tree species that we did mention have biocontrol agents available in the country. And if not, a lot of them have very promising programs that just need a bit of investment to start looking at getting more and more of these species targeted. And that is really the aim of the Northern Weeds Temperate Weeds program at the CBC. So if you have any further questions about the program, please do let us know. And all I wanted to say is thank you, and I hope our mountains don't look like this in the future.
Thank you, Kim. I think we've got about 40 seconds for a burning question. Brian?
Sure. The fold mountains, you showed for the Cape fold mountains the most common species. And pines weren't there. Go turn it around. That helps. This better? So, if you can find that slide, yes, is that it? No, there was one where you showed the Cape Fold Mountains.
Yes. Yeah. So I think this is the previous with this is the historic database that we, and there is a pine species, Pinus pinasta is there. I think it's just this is just the last 3 years. So
Yeah, there you go.
yeah, it is surprising that they aren't here in the last.
So what does that show? You show the most abundant invasive alien plants since 2021.
Yeah, so it was just that, so the previous records are obviously more accurate. It was all the records up until that point. So it was up until 2021. This was just for interest's sake on, in the last 3 years, what has been recorded. And pines, they're still there, but they weren't the most abundant in the last 3 years. It doesn't reflect the true situation.
Yeah, the impression I got just
yeah.
driving through it the other day over quite a distance is just pines everywhere, and all the way up there must be Williams Holes all the way up the mountain.
Exactly. I think the thing with iNaturalist that I think it needs to be said is that people, it's a citizen science platform. It's not targeted. It's not focused. And I think a lot of the time when people are recording records, they're often going for novelty or something that might stand out in a landscape. I think and I'm guilty of this as well, we forget to also record what is common and what is building up huge numbers. And so that's why I think, again, I didn't have time to go into it, but I think that's why we need to balance having focused, invested surveys where we have experts going in and we have and the goal is to get a picture of abundance, and not just, what we feel like taking a picture of. Yeah.
And then we have one online question. It's from Jacqueline. Have you thought about working with the Mountain Club of South Africa? People going into the mountains all the time, and some are active conservationists. And she's going to the Magaliesberg with the crew Citizen Science with Sam B this weekend.
Okay, that's amazing. Actually, we're currently about to have a project put on iNaturalist as well, where we're going to be just focusing in and putting in the shapefiles for mountain areas, and then we want to start reaching out to initiatives like that where we say, please upload it to the project. In fact, in iNaturalist, luckily, it does it automatically once you load a project, and we're hoping then we'll be able to see if there's improvement once we actually put a call for it and do it that way.
We'll have one final one.
It's a quick comment. I use iNat a lot, but I'm lazy, so a lot of my invasive species pictures are actually up the mountain, but I'm standing down here, so I don't know how you correct for that, but it's just an observation. I'm guilty of doing that myself.
Yeah, I suppose I think that exactly is the whole problem, is that it is difficult to go and get those difficult to reach areas. I suppose though, if it's still valuable if it's a very clear. I'm sure we could still use that if it's a very clear. You could still see what it is and understand. Yeah, identify it from there. Yeah.
Thank you, Kim. Just final round of applause. Thank you. I think the one thing Ralph could add to that is that the top of the mountains definitely aren't alien free. He's been going up to 3,300 meters and the invasives are up there. So it is a sampling bias. It's not an ecological bias. Quite exciting. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today, but we have Peter Leroux next speaking about definitely for the areas we come from, one of the very worst bush encroacher, and something that's received very little attention. And this work Peter's been involved in, I think, is really going to highlight the knowledge gaps with regard to the species, but potentially the massive impacts that are going to come with it. Peter, you there?
Hi, thanks so much. Can you hear me there? Can you see the presentation?
All looks good. We can hear you and see you.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much, and thanks for the opportunity to present online. Hopefully, next year I'll be in person at GSSA. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we know and what we don't know about leucocidia at the moment. Some of this presentation borrows heavily from a manuscript that's currently in preparation, that's being led by Ona with several of today's other presenters as co-authors. So maybe keep an eye open for that if this is of interest to you. Okay, so why are we so interested in leucocidia? And of course, Grant has kind of touched on that already, but let me kind of suggest 3 reasons. The first is that this is one of the very few indigenous woody species which becomes dominant in our montane grasslands. One of the very few that will form dense, thick stands. Second, and I know this goes for pretty much all of our grasswood species, but it is a poorly studied species. So, for example, in Web of Science, there are only 34 articles that list Leucocidia sericea, and of those, 25 deal with potential medicinal uses. So there's very little actually about the ecology and the biology of the species. And then thirdly, what's most relevant today, of course, is that this is a species that we're worried about as an encroacher. Now, there's pretty good consensus among the farmers and the ecologists in the region that this species is expanding locally and is growing at much higher densities. And this concern is so serious that the species has been controlled by working for water for several years now. What do we base this encroachment on? Obviously, a lot of it is farmers' experience and people living in the region. But we also get some evidence from, for example, repeat photography, and this is a figure from that manuscript that's under preparation. And I particularly like in the bottom row here, where in the foreground, you can really kind of clearly make out that it's Leucocidia that is growing at a higher density and growing on a slope where it was previously absent. We can also use aerial imagery, and this is a nice paired image from the Clarence area, and you can see how along that stream, the vegetation structure has changed considerably. One has to obviously go in to ground truth it, and you can see that, in reality, it's a lot of Leucocidia encroaching along that stream bank. However, the first, I think, main message that comes out from looking at what's known about Leucocidia is that there hasn't yet been a systematic or broad-scale study testing for whether encroachment is occurring or documenting the rate at which it's occurring. And I think this is really important because we might see differences in encroachment across altitude or across climatic gradients, or more likely even along land use, different land uses. So this seems to be a really big and important gap in our understanding at the moment. Okay, what about the basics for the species? Well, Leucocidia is largely limited to South African Lesotho, particularly the eastern half of the subregion. We got some populations in Eswatini, and then some interesting outlying populations in the eastern highlands of Zimbabwe. Leucocidia is a monotypic genus, so there are no very close relatives that we need to be concerned about here. Species is insect pollinated and wind dispersed, but there's been no work looking at those processes in any details. And in terms of distribution, when we look at the field guides, you'll see it says something like this is a species that's limited to damp areas in cold mountains or cold grasslands. So not a very detailed understanding of the habitat requirements for the species. So let's stick with this idea of habitat and distribution, because I think there's some interesting insights there. And of course, with all the online data we've got access to, it's pretty straightforward to run species distribution models. And this is an example that was run with MaxEnt. So this is based on occurrence records from GBIF and coarse scale temperature and rainfall variables from WorldClim. So it gives us actually a really good fit to the data with the AUC score of 0.9. And that really just means this is a very good model for describing these patterns of occurrence. So that's interesting in of itself, that these coarse scale temperature and rainfall variables give us a good fit to where the species is observed to occur. If we dig a little bit deeper into those variables, here are the key predictors that were identified, and you'll see that annual precipitation stands out head and shoulders above the others in terms of its influence on Leucocidia distribution. Now, interestingly, there's been a much more recent paper published by Ona and some of the other people in the room there, where they modeled the distribution of Leucocidia as well as some other woody encroachers or expanders across the whole of Africa. And in that study, isothermality came out as the key predictor. So there's a little bit of contrast depending what the scope of the modeling is. But I think the useful point here is that, again, in that study, the coarse scale climate predictors gave a really good fit. Okay, and obviously, as William said, we've got to be careful for correlations and interpreting them too heavily. But I think this is kind of an interesting point to build on. I'd suggest we then kind of zoom in a little bit to a finer scale. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that was done just within the Gladstone section of Golden Gate, so a really much tinier extent. And this is work that was done. There were about 300 odd quadrats surveyed and looking for whether Leucocidia was present or not, and a whole bunch of easy to quantify environmental variables were measured in each quadrant, and then several were calculated using GIS. And there's kind of the list there, and you can see 10 of those 13 variables were significantly correlated with the occurrence of Leucocidia. Great, that's interesting. We can kind of narrow it down to 6 variables that are kind of particularly important if we use a model building approach. And that's great. That tells us some predictors here that we should be considering that might be kind of mechanistically linked to the fine scale occurrence patterns of the species. The only problem here is that even with all of those variables, we were still only explaining about a third of the variation in where Leucocidia is found, suggesting that from these easily measured variables, we're missing something. And I'd maybe like to zoom in on fire and disturbance in general here as a starting point about what we might be missing. So, well, what do we know about fire and Leucocidia? Well, Leucocidia is really very fire tolerant. So, for example, in Cathedral Peak catchment, when a big fire went through there, Leucocidia had about a 98% survival rate. We know it resprouts really profusely after fires. And indeed, when fires occur, it seems like the relative dominance of Leucocidia goes up relative to other more fire-sensitive species. We also know that fire, well, we know something about how fire might affect recruitment in Leucocidia. There's a lab experiment that shows that germination was improved by exposure to smoke, but also field data that shows that establishment isn't improved by fire. So there's still some stuff to disentangle there. And I think maybe, for example, in that fine scale habitat study, fire was just the number of years since the last burn. And maybe there's some value to be considering, for example, how the frequency of fires could affect leukocydia. And maybe the frequency of fires interacting with the seasonality of fires would be something interesting to study if there's appropriate data sets. A different type of disturbance that we need to consider is, of course, herbivory. There's kind of incidental observations of both wild game and domestic livestock browsing on leukocydia, but no kind of detailed studies to tell us whether browsing has a significant impact on the growth or productivity of the species. But there's some interesting kind of suggestions in the grey literature. There are farmers who suggest that some varieties of goat are really good at controlling leukocydia. And then there's some ideas about how earland browsing might be able to control leukocydia also. Interestingly, leukocydia seems to have quite a diverse invertebrate fauna associated with it. There was one study that documented around about 150 beetle species on leukocydia in Golden Gate, and of those, about a third were potentially feeding on the leaves of this species. So there's a whole herbivory side to leukocydia that I think we don't have an adequate grasp on yet. Now, I'd like to switch gears a little bit from talking about how other species affect leukocydia to what we know about how leukocydia affects the environments it grows in. And here, maybe it's worthwhile saying that we've got to recognize that leukocydia occurs under a range of densities. So it could be super low densities like this, or moderate densities like this, where we start seeing big shrubs, but the canopies there's still a big gap between the canopies. And most of the work I'm going to be talking about from here on has been done at this kind of density. But we mustn't forget that we can also have leukocydia pretty much forming closed canopies in some areas. And we really don't have as good an understanding of these dense leukocydia thickets, what effects they have. Okay, so when we're thinking about leukocydia's effect on the environment, maybe the first thing we can think about is microclimate. This is just a snapshot study which was done in Golden Gate. So it's poor replication, poor temporal extent. But it's interesting to note here that leukocydia was able to lower, or not was able to, it lowered soil temperatures, but had minimal effect on soil moisture, at least in the upper layers, and minimal effects on air temperature. And I think if we're going to go into this in more detail, we probably also want to think about humidity and maybe even wind speed as other variables to try and assess, because it feels likely that leukocydia is going to affect those. Okay, how does this then impact the vegetation? Okay, well, here we've got data on species cover on the top row and species richness in the bottom row, sampled under leukocydia, so that's the green, and away from leukocydia in the open vegetation in yellow, so the surrounding grassland. This is data from Golden Gate again. And we can see surprisingly, wrong way. We can see surprisingly that species richness showed no difference under and away from leukocydia under kind of medium leukocydia density, although there was this very small but significant suppression of grass species richness. Much more noticeably, we had a significant decline in vascular plant cover, really driven strongly by a negative effect of leukocydia on grass cover. Now, this is kind of just summary metrics. What about the species composition? Do we maybe see different species growing under leukocydia than in the open? And when we started this work, we kind of speculated, well, maybe we're going to see species from the kloof forests kind of moving under leukocydia. So this is a bit of a busy slide, but we've got 9 plots here, each representing 9 different sites within Golden Gate. And this is an ordination with each polygon representing the species composition under and away from leukocydia. And I think the clear message here is that there's massive overlap in the species composition. When we run the analyses, it says, yeah, there's a significant effect, but it is a minuscule effect. So leukocydia doesn't have a strong effect on species composition. We got the same species generally under and away from leukocydia, at least at moderate densities. And indeed, in this study, site was far, far more important than in determining species composition than Leucocidia presence, even though all these sites were fairly close together. Now, this is, again, it feels like a slightly unexpected result, but fortunately, this work has been repeated in a slightly different way at 4 other sites. And here's data from 3 of them. The 4th shows the same pattern. But again, when repeated, Leucocidia at moderate densities shows no effect on species richness or on species composition. So this kind of fits what I think farmers have been telling us for a long time, that Leucocidia is having a negative effect on grazing capacity. And I think we got to also be aware that that could then have knock-on effects. Having lower grass could lead to greater opportunities for soil erosion and so on. So this is something that I think needs more attention again. Also important to note that there have been no studies, at least in the peer-reviewed literature, about how Leucocidia affects fauna or even how it affects ecosystem processes. Okay, just a last slide from my side before we wrap up. We're obviously living in this changing world, warmer temperatures, changes in rainfall, and this massive enrichment in CO2. And we got to remember that that could be mediating or moderating the impacts or the rate at which Leucocidia is spreading and encroaching. And we got a few little insights on this. There's a dissertation that was published that came out at WITS recently, where they looked at in a lab setting, increasing the temperature and the CO2 experienced by Leucocidia, as well as 2 other grasses, and there was no effect on the growth or the competitiveness of Leucocidia. It was a short-term experiment, but it's kind of an interesting insight that I think we can build on. And then if we think back to the SDM studies, the one that was conducted across African montane landscapes, it tried to forecast the distribution of Leucocidia under different climate change scenarios, and it actually found a net contraction. But we also have some ideas that this is a species that has the potential to expand upslope, and we'll hear more about that later, suggesting that under climate change, there could be some interesting changes in the species distribution. And then just from the South African scale species distribution model, the idea that, well, rainfall could be more important than temperature in determining how the species shifts, which adds a bit more uncertainty because, of course, it's harder to predict changes in rainfall than changes in temperature. And then, of course, we've got to recognize that the other global environmental change drivers like nitrogen deposition, changes in land use, and invasive species, we don't have an understanding of how Leucocidia is affected by those or is going to interact with those. Okay, so I'm going to be a little bit arrogant here and suggest 3 questions or 3 groups of questions that I think we should be putting a bit more emphasis on. And I'd be really happy if people disagree with me. But I think the first thing that we need to be prioritizing in terms of Leucocidia research is documenting across broad scales, across gradients, where and how fast Leucocidia is encroaching. And we need to then understand whether global environmental change is going to be accelerating that or inhibiting that. Second, in areas where Leucocidia is encroaching, I think we need to understand the potential for herbivory and fire to control the species. And equally, will climate extremes actually be a limit? Will they be a cap on how far the species can spread or be able to knock it back in some settings? And I'd be really interested to know if anyone knows of old data sets that we could use as the basis for a demographic study going further. And then finally, and this is, I think, equally important, we need more information about how Leucocidia is affecting ecosystem processes and how it's affecting ecosystem services. And especially then at high densities, are we also seeing an impact on biodiversity there, since at moderate densities we haven't yet seen that? Yeah, I look forward to hearing your guys' thoughts on this. Many thanks to the organizers for letting me speak remotely. I appreciate that. And also just a thanks to Sandparks and the NRF for the support for some of the unpublished work that we presented here. Great, thanks so much.
questions for Peter too. Somebody's got a burning question. Peter, do you still hear us?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Hello? I'm just wondering whether you've looked at the Cathedral Peak data, because there's this famous catchment 9 where fire has been suppressed for many decades. And Leucocydia there has formed a closed canopy. And you know, suppression of fire, it certainly is a fire tolerance thing once it's in there. But to get in the first place, it would seem from catchment 9 of decades of fire suppression that really makes one hell of a difference.
Yeah, that's a really interesting case study. So there's a paper by Andrew de Villiers and Tim O'Connor where they actually document the most recent fire, and they show how, I think it was an Erica species was the dominant woody plant, and after that big fire, Leucocydia just overtook it massively. So yeah, it's a really interesting case study, and it seems that one recent fire, once Leucocydia was present there, that one recent fire was able to, push it to being super dominant. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Peter. Sorry, we're running a bit late, so we're going to just thank you. You received astounding applause this side. Okay, we have another online talk now, and it's again somebody I know who really wanted to be here and tried her best to be here. But unfortunately just couldn't make it, and Michelle's going to be speaking to us about the HydroVeg program and the recent developments within that program. It's a video. Cool, so I can't speak to it.
Morning, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there today, but I look forward to interacting with you virtually during the course of this workshop. This morning, I'm going to be talking about the work that we have been doing on the impacts of woody expansion on water resources. In South Africa, only 9% of our rainfall on average reaches our river systems. And this is because a large portion of our rainfall is partitioned to evapotranspiration. What this means is that any change in land cover or land use or the management thereof changes the evapotranspiration component, and this leads to a change in the water resources from a landscape. If we look at this in terms of the hydrological processes, you have incoming rainfall, which is intercepted by your vegetation. From there, the balance is infiltrated and contributes to your soil water store. From there, it moves down through the soil horizons into the groundwater or laterally and contributes to your stream flow components. The vegetation, through its roots, draws up water for transpiration, and you also get soil water evaporation, which takes place. If the vegetation changes, all these components of the hydrological cycle are altered. Similarly, if the management thereof, say for example, there's plowing which occurs, or you get overgrazing of a landscape, all these components of the hydrological cycle are also altered. In 2019, we set up a program to look at the influence of woody encroachment on water, and this was done under the SSRP program with funding from the NRF. And so the way that we conceptualized this was to start with in-situ observations. From there, we brought in remote sensing data, which we used the in-situ data to ground truth. We used the understanding from the in-situ data and the remote sensing to feed into the hydrological models. And from there, we could produce estimates of what woody encroachment would mean for water resources at a catchment scale, and eventually we'll move up to a national scale to understand that. We had various sites around the country. We had a paired approach where we had a encroached site. So this example up here in the left is from Mopani. So there was an encroached Mopani stand and then a cleared stand. From Adelaide in the Eastern Cape, a more Albany thicket site where it was cleared and encroached. And then in the Drakensberg grassland, we had a clear grassland site and an encroached site with leucocidia. At each of these sites, we had very heavy instrumentation and observation. Our primary observations were around the evapotranspiration components. To be able to do this, we used two different approaches. We used the eddy covariance method and the surface renewal method. So the eddy covariance approach is an expensive approach. It's technologically demanding as well, so you've got to have a lot of expertise and technical expertise, and the data is quite heavy. The surface renewal approach is a far cheaper method and requires far fewer sensors and is less data intensive. The advantage of the eddy covariance is that not only do you get your ET, but you also get gaseous fluxes, as well as your energy balance. In the surface renewal, you get your energy balance, and ultimately you can then calculate your ET. The surface renewal method also requires a far smaller area of homogeneous vegetation that you need to monitor over. Up until we started this project, the surface renewal method had been used extensively over agricultural crops, but very limited application over natural vegetation. So the initial stages were to demonstrate the robustness of the surface renewal approach over natural vegetation, and we showed that it's a very adequate method for measuring ET and natural vegetation. We then complemented this with measurements of the weather, the temperature, relative humidity, rainfall, intensive soil water monitoring, infiltration testing, and then at the catchment scale, an integrator of stream flow was measured. For this presentation, I'm going to concentrate on the results that we got from the Cathedral Peak research catchments. So these catchments are located in the Maluti Drakensberg. They were established in the early 1930s and 1938, and they were designed initially to look at the impacts of commercial afforestation on water. Over time, they progressed to look at different land treatment influences on water. Monitoring was ceased in 1995, but Zayan re-established monitoring in these catchments in 2012. For the purposes of the woody encroachment work, we looked at catchment 6, which is a grassland catchment, and catchment 9, which was a fire exclusion catchment and has thus transitioned towards a more woody land cover over time. Climatically, these two catchments are very similar. The rainfall pattern is shown in the graph above here, and you can see it's very similar. Temperature-wise, they are very similar, and the same for solar radiation. What does differ is the land cover. So catchment 6 is a fire-adapted Thermida triandra grassland in near natural condition. Senesces in the winter and is managed with a biennial spring burn. Whereas catchment 9 is a fire exclusion catchment. Fire has been excluded from this catchment for as much as possible since 1959, but unfortunately there have been wildfires and arson fires which have gone through this catchment, so it's not completely excluded, but there are no management burns which take place. Over time, the vegetation has transitioned to a more woody coverage with leucocidia. This leucocidia does not senesce in winter, it remains evergreen during the winter months and has a different understory to the grassland. So what we started with was to look at the evapotranspiration, but alongside this we also looked at the interception. So I'm going to just present those results before I move on to the evaporation. So below the leucocidia we installed through-fall troughs, that's shown in this top image. And then we also had stem flow collars on the stems of the trees, and we had microlysimeters to look at litter interception. We had 2 replicates of these. Unfortunately, the third set gave us hassles, and we've only got the data from the 2 sets. What we could find from this is that 29% of the rainfall was intercepted by the leucocidia. It is quite a significant component of the rainfall was held by the leukocydia and evaporated before transpiration started occurring. In terms of evapotranspiration, the grey line here is the grassland and the black line is the leukocydia. The green areas show the summer months and the brown show the winter months. What was evident is that during the summer months, the evapotranspiration was similar between the leukocydia and the grassland. It's during the winter months that there was a marked difference. The grassland transpiration drops off markedly, whereas the leukocydia continues to transpire, although at a lesser extent. In the wetter summer months, so in the years where we had quite a high summer rainfall, the similarities were even greater between the grassland and the leukocydia in terms of evapotranspiration. And looking at this another way, we're looking at here the accumulated evapotranspiration. Green is summer, brown is winter. And once this is a hydrological year starting from October, once we move into the winter months, you can see the tapering off of the grassland evapotranspiration, those grey lines, whereas the leukocydia continues to accumulate through the winter period. So there's quite a marked difference by the end of the year between the grassland at a lower ET and the leukocydia at a higher ET. Looking at the stream flow, that same pattern between the seasons is evident, with little difference in the summer months, but marked differences in the winter months, with the grassland having a higher stream flow during the winter months than what the leukocydia catchments have, because of the higher ET that occurs in the leukocydia catchments in the winter months. What is shown here is the stream flow and the rainfall. So the black line is the stream flow, annual stream flows, and the grey bars are the annual rainfall. The top graph is catchment 6, and the bottom graph is catchment 9, the leukocydia catchment. And the burns that occurred are indicated on these graphs. So what we can see is this is the historical period going from 1961, and then the break is when monitoring ceased, and then we have the current period of record towards the end of the graphs. Looking towards the end of the graphs, you can see that relatively the stream flow is lower from catchment 9 compared against catchment 6. A different way of looking at that is in terms of the runoff response ratio. So this is how much of the rainfall is converted to runoff. Dating from 1961 to 2022 on this graph, the runoff response ratio between catchments 9 and 6 was quite similar to start with. As time progressed and catchment 9 moved to a more woody species, so you can see the difference occurring between the two catchments, with the grey blocks being at the bottom, those are catchment 9 having a low conversion of rainfall to runoff. In the current period, so here at the end of the graph, grey blocks are markedly below the black blocks, meaning a very low portion of rainfall is converted to runoff in catchment 9. On average, we're getting about 0.35, 35% of our rainfall is converted to runoff in catchment 9, whereas in catchment 6, 60% of the rainfall is being converted to runoff. We then used this understanding and moved into a hydrological model. What we found here is moving towards the bigger areas. This is a catchment upstream of Spierenkop Dam, moving from the Cathedral Peak research catchments down towards Spierenkop Dam, so a larger area. At this scale, it became even more apparent that the influence was coming through in the winter months and particularly in the drier years. So if we have a drought period or drier period, that influence on the stream flow was particularly marked. In the context of South Africa, we rely on a small portion of our land area, 10% of our land area, to produce 50% of our water resources. And this land area is delineated strategic water source areas. So strategic water source areas are areas that produce disproportionately more runoff to the land area that they occupy. And many of these strategic water source areas fall within the grassland biomes. So if we start to see a move to a more woody encroachments in our grasslands, we are going to see influences on our water resources, particularly in our dry winter months. And it's during these dry months that we rely very heavily on our water towers, our strategic water areas, to maintain that river flow, that base flow that sustains us during the dry periods. There's also an interaction with carbon. So 60% of our national carbon stocks are found in grasslands. If we have more carbon in a landscape, we have greater soil water retention. Earlier this week, Lindo Dlamini presented on work that he has done in the Cathedral Peak research catchments on carbon. What he showed is that the grasslands store more soil carbon, they release less CO2 and have more aggregate stability than the woody encroachment sites. What we know is greater soil carbon and greater aggregates leads to more soil water retention. So in conclusion, what is emerging from the work in the Cathedral Peak research catchment is that the grasslands are definitely favourable in terms of water. If we get woody encroachment, we are definitely seeing more evapotranspiration and less stream flow, particularly in the dry winter months or the drier years. What we also know is from Lindo's work is that the carbon stores are higher in the grassland than what they are in the woody encroached catchments. So moving forward, when we look at our grassland biome and the woody encroachment, we need to consider all aspects. We need to take a nexus approach to managing these landscapes. We've got to consider the biodiversity, the water, the carbon, and the energy, and look at the trade-offs and the feedbacks between these. We can't allow for this push that is coming from the European side for a move to a woodier landscape for carbon purposes, whereas our research is definitely showing the opposite of that. It is not in our favour for water or for carbon. Thank you very much.
Access to her. Is she there on tech?
I'm here.
Brilliant. Hello. Anyone have
Hi, Grant.
questions?
If I could make just a comment on the previous question around the leucocidia with the fire, with Tim's paper and Andrew de Villiers, what we found there, it's not directly related to Michelle's, but it has bearing on what happened there. The fire does knock back the leucocidia, but once it's denser, then the fire doesn't get in. It's not that the fire was promoting the leucocidia. If we had frequent fires there, the leucocidia would disappear again.
Did you get that, Michelle? I think it was more of a comment.
Yeah, thanks.
I have a question. You described this nexus approach to management. Can you expand on that a bit?
Sure. So, Grant, what I was trying to get at is we've got to consider the water, the carbon, and the biodiversity. So quite often the management objectives coming from the European side are one directional in terms of carbon sequestration. In our landscape, the water is as crucial. In terms of the energy, we also see a change in the albedo, and from that, a change in the partitioning of the different components of the energy balance when we get a woodier species. So my sort of push is to consider all the different aspects, not only one-dimensional approach.
Yeah, I agree. I'm hoping that's something that's going to come up a bit later in this discussion this afternoon is even through our own government and policies, how are we looking at management going forward and our options?
Michelle, that was a brilliant talk. An absolute pleasure to listen through to it. I was wondering so the key thing is whether plants are active in winter. And I was wondering in terms of grasses, C3 versus C4, do you have any sense of what might happen if those C4 grasses have changed to C3?
Thanks, William. That's next on the list. I think we do need to look at that. We're starting, there's been a bit of work done on the changes in albedo over the catchments. I think we've now starting to get the ET data so that we can see if there has been a change correlated with that albedo changes. It's very difficult to find an isolated patch to monitor over to be able to separate out the influences and to then integrate that at the catchment scale to look at the stream flow response.
Just one more question from Ralph.
I just want to comment on that. William and I were chatting about it last night. It might be easier to monitor in the C3, C4 ecotone, which in the Berg is between 2,500 and 2,800 meters. So one could perhaps develop a protocol there. But Bitsie's Hook could be a good instrumentation site because the landscape is not too extreme. The ecotone is actually easily accessible and the topography is not too difficult to monitor. The disadvantage of that site is that it is a north-facing slope. So it's not necessarily representative of all the aspects in the Berg, but logistic accessibility is probably easier to deal with than trying to have representative aspect. So the Cathedral Peak site, your C3, C4 ecotone is actually on the basalt escarpment, which makes it impractical to try and measure. It's a sheer cliff, so but there are other places that one could try and set up a long-term monitoring protocol to look at what the interaction between C3, C4 communities is doing, and if they're shifting with elevation or behaving in other ways in terms of key variables. So something for the FTN landscape to keep in mind. Yeah.
Ralph?
Any more questions? Yeah, thank you, Michelle.